Hi, I'm Dollarcoin. In today's tutorial, I want to be talking to you about how I mixed this song. So the short answer is to mix in mono with a high-pass filter. I'm going to separate this tutorial into two different parts. In the first part, I explain why this technique works. I use visuals, notes, and examples for you guys to follow along. In the second part, I explain the best way to apply this into everyday workflow. I go through my Emulator audio effect rack and how to best use it using Ableton's key function. The timestamps for application and explanation are going to be below. Also, as a quick disclaimer, I do want to mention that there is some mastering in this project, but it's just a limiter with a character all the way to fast, so it's not really changing the mix. Without further ado, let's get right into the explanation. So first of all, why do we want to mix in mono? The original reason is to make sure that your mixes sound good on all different kinds of speaker systems, including laptop speakers, phone speakers, club speakers, especially any kind of speaker system that only has one speaker. But then you guys might be wondering, if I'm mixing without being able to hear the stereo, aren't my stereo mixes going to suffer as a result? And I'm here to tell you that your stereo mixes are actually going to benefit tremendously from mixing in mono, and I'll explain why. So first, I want to establish this idea that volume and distance are basically the same thing. If you think about it, sounds that are loud are very close to you, whilst sounds that are quiet are far away. Of course, there are some exceptions, but that's the general rule. So let's get into the second benefit of mixing in mono, which is 2-dimension versus 1-dimension mixing. Take a look at figure 1. If you are in the middle, and you take a look at an object to the left of you and another object to the right of you, it's very difficult to tell in this position which of these two objects are farther away. For this example, I put the object to the right deliberately farther away, but at first glance it might be a little bit difficult to tell. Now compare that with figure 2. If you are in the middle and you are looking at an object directly in front of you, and you're looking at another object also directly in front of you, you can even argue that it is objective to say which of those two objects are closer or farther away. And remember what I was saying before about volume being distance. When you are looking at everything in one dimension, it is much easier to tell what the distance is. Now, I'm not trying to make the argument that mixing is somehow objective, however. I just want to make that clear. Of course, if you have a background ambient sound, for instance, you're going to want that to be a little bit quieter. But by mixing in mono, you're going to have a much better, more educated opinion on how your mixes sound. But at this point, you guys might be still wondering, yes, but if I can't hear the stereo when I'm mixing, and I have stereo and mono sounds in my song, then won't the stereo sounds be way too loud? I mean, I'm only going to be mixing with like half of the sound. And there's some legitimacy to that, but I'm here to tell you that actually the stereo should be a little bit louder. If you take a look at figure 3 and figure 4, you're going to be able to understand a little bit clearer. If you are in the middle and you have an object to the left and right of you, which represents the stereo sound, and you have an object directly in front of you, which represents the mono sound, if you are mixing in stereo, then chances are what you think is an even mix is probably going to result in the mono signal being a little bit too loud. Metaphorically speaking, if you put all of these objects in a straight line, then the object in the middle is going to be naturally closer to you than the object on the sides. However, if you look at figure 4, if you have the stereo sound a little bit louder than the mono sound, then each of these objects are going to be the same distance away from you. I like to imagine this like the difference between sitting on a couch and looking at a regular TV versus sitting on a couch and looking directly at a curved TV. Because it's a curved TV, every part of the TV is the same distance away from you. And remember what I was saying before about volume being distance. So the last reason why you want to be mixing in mono is to make sure that your drums and sub are consistent. I'm going to be taking an example from an earlier song of mine that I made roughly 2 years ago. I want you to pay close attention on the drums and sub bass of this song, particularly with the kick drum because that's where I think the changes and the inconsistencies is the most obvious. I'm going to play the song in 3, 2, 1. When I made this song, I knew nothing about mixing in mono, especially not with a high-pass filter. The reason why the drums and sub are inconsistent is because usually the main transients of your drums, along with the sub bass, are going to be in mono. So if your mono signal is loud sometimes and quiet other times, like it is in this song, then your drums and sub are going to pop through only some of the time. However, if you take a look at a later track that I made, Copper, you'll notice that the drums and sub are far more consistent because I had found out about mixing in mono. I'll play it for you in 3, 2, 1. Alright, so now let's get into the topic of why we want to be mixing with a high-pass filter. So the original reason why we want to be mixing in mono in the first place is to make sure that our mixes sound good on all different kinds of speaker systems. By checking our mixes with a high-pass filter, we are able to know whether or not our mixes are going to sound good on phone speakers, laptop speakers, or any kind of speaker system that lacks bass. But then at this point you guys might be wondering, well, if I mix with a high-pass filter, I can only hear so much of my bass sounds, and I'm going to hear a lot of my high-frequency sounds like hi-hats and risers. Are my mixes going to sound way too dark if I mix with a high-pass filter? And again, I am here to tell you that your mixes actually are going to sound a little bit darker when mixing with a high-pass filter for exactly that reason. I do recommend that you should be mixing things like sub-bass, for instance, with a high-pass filter because that's obviously not possible. But yes, your bass, you're only going to be able to hear so much of it, which is going to motivate you to turn it up. And because you're only listening to the high frequency sounds like hi-hats and risers, you're probably going to be turning down. But again, I'm here to tell you that it probably should be that way, as a result of a concept known as the pyramid of sound. This is a concept that was explained to me in Region Band a few years back. Basically, in a concert band setting, you want all the high-frequency instruments like piccolo or flute to be a little bit quieter, whilst you want all your low-frequency bass instruments like baritone or tuba to be a little bit louder, and that way the concert band sounds right to the human ear. You can apply this concept into electronic dance music as well, by having bass sounds to be a little bit louder, whilst having your high-frequency sounds like hi-hats and risers to be a little bit quieter. Your mix is going to sound a lot more desirable on phone speakers or any kind of speaker system that lacks bass. Alright, so let's begin with the application portion of this tutorial. I've just opened up a brand new Ableton Live set, and in my default set I have the Emulator audio effect rack already set up. But I'm going to delete it, and we're going to start from scratch so you guys can see how it's made. So first, you're going to open up a brand new audio effect rack and put it on the master. Then you're going to take a utility and an EQ8. With this utility, you're going to want to put the width all the way to 0, and this is going to create the mono effect. And with the EQ, you're going to want to turn off 3 and 4, which leaves you with 1 and 2. For 1, you're going to want to set this to a high-pass filter, and you're going to want to set the frequency anywhere in between 200 to 1000 Hertz. I'm going to set it up to 400 just for this example. Also, I like to have 2 being set to a low-pass filter as well, because then I would be able to check sub-bass. I know it's not really related to the tutorial, but it's very convenient to have at the beginning of every project. So now, I'm going to set this up with Ableton's key button. Simply click the key button, set the on-off of the entire rack to 1, the on-off of the utility to 2, the on-off of the high-pass filter to 3, and the on-off of the low-pass filter to 4. This way, every time you click 1, 2, and 3, and 4, the rack starts changing as you wish. And now, of course, at this point, you go to Options, Preferences, File Folder, and Save Current Set as default. And there you basically have it. So when it comes to using this technique in your everyday workflow, there's a couple of quick points that I want to mention. First point that I want to make is that you generally want to put the EQ8 on oversampling mode and put the gain to -6. I'm going to demonstrate with this kick that I have here. That when I have the rack turned off, I'm going to pull up the master here, you'll notice that the master levels at 0 dB. However, when I turn on the audio effect rack, the EQ is high passing and it's reducing frequencies, but the signal is now clipping. That's just something you have to understand about EQs. So you might want to click oversampling and turn the gain down a little bit. I'd like to put it at -6. So therefore the kick doesn't clip like crazy or anything like that. Another point that I want to make is that the higher the frequency of the high pass filter, the darker the mix. If you think about it, as you increase the frequency of the high pass filter, the high frequency sounds like hi-hats and risers become more apparent, whilst it becomes harder to hear the bass sounds that are getting more high passed. So keep in mind that when you bump up the frequency, there are going to be consequences to your mixdowns. Another point that I want to mention is that using mono with a high pass filter should be a guideline. You want to be checking to make sure if your mixes sound good on all different speaker systems, not making your mixes sound only good on a phone speaker. The same way you should be checking your mixes to see if they sound good in mono with a high pass filter, you should be checking your mixes to see if they sound good in stereo and bass listening platforms. The final 2 points that I want to make is that, first, this is a really good technique for mixing on the go. If you think about it, you don't want to be scrapping really good ideas simply because of poor mixing execution. This way you can make a beat late at night, and then when you go to bed, you don't hate it in the morning. Secondly, this is a really great technique for checking your mix at the very end, because the only alternative to using an emulator inside of Ableton is to export everything out to SoundCloud and then actually listen to it on a phone speaker. Alright, so if you guys enjoyed this tutorial, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments below if there are other topics that you want me to cover. Also, I do mixing, mastering, ghost production, private lessons, and video game composition. If you're interested in any of those things, please let me know at dollarcoinmusic@gmail.com, and I will talk to you soon.